We are bringing in via a pre-recorded presentation, and then the presenters will join us live for a Q&A. We have Lauren, Shelley, and Dr. Jane Waite with Aston University to discuss behaviors that challenge in SAS, their research overview and strategies to manage behavior.
Hi, my name is Lauren Shelley and I'm a doctoral researcher at Aston University and within the Cerebral Network. And today I'm going to be presenting an overview of my PhD on behaviours that challenge in SAPB2 associated syndrome, and this is to inform the second stage of this presentation where Dr. Jane Waite will be focusing on strategies that might be applied to manage these behaviours. So just as a brief introduction to the Cerebral Network, research within the network is focused on behaviour, cognition and emotion in people with rare genetic syndromes. And this is important because we know that changes at the level of the gene can impact on development and lead to a behavioural phenotype. And a behavioural phenotype is when a person with a given genetic syndrome is more likely to show certain behavioural, cognitive and emotional characteristics compared to someone who does not have that syndrome. And so this area of research is really important for understanding outcomes in different syndrome groups so that we can inform clinical services to support people, particularly when characteristics include behaviours that challenge or mental health difficulties. And this slide here is just to give a bit of an overview of our research process. So parents and caregivers have reported behaviours that challenge in SAPB2 and that these behaviours are of concern to them. And so we've been conducting studies to describe and understand these behaviours and what some of the causes might be, so that we can start to put together SAPB2 specific models for behaviour and identify what appropriate strategies and interventions might be. So today's presentation is going to cover several areas. So first of all, what behaviours that challenge are, then an overview of each of our studies that we've conducted, and then Jane is going to take over with some tips for managing behaviours. And just before I do go on to talk about our findings, I just want to say that although the behavioural phenotype of certain syndromes is associated with specific characteristics or behaviours, we also know that every person is different. And so this means that not everyone with a given syndrome is going to share the same characteristics or behaviours. And this means that behaviours that challenge are not inevitable, and when they do occur, they are amenable to change. So whilst I'm going to be talking about some difficulties today, these difficulties might not be relevant for all individuals with SAPB2. So behaviours that challenge have been defined as behaviours of an intensity, frequency or duration that impacts the safety of the person or those around them, or behaviours that might limit or deny access to activities and a community. So this is quite a broad definition of behaviour, but it can be narrowed down into different types. So for example, behaviours directed towards others, such as hair pulling, hitting or scratching, self-injury, and then behaviours towards objects or the environment, so things like throwing objects or slamming doors. And these are terms that we use to describe different types of behaviours, but it's really important to note that these behaviours might act as a form of communication and that they're often not intentional. And these behaviours are reported in all populations, but we do know that they have been shown to occur at increased rates in people with rare genetic syndromes and intellectual disability. And from past research, we know that there are several factors that and characteristics that can increase the likelihood of these behaviours occurring. So for example, less developed daily living skills, such as the ability to wash or dress, difficulties with mobility or communication difficulties. And what we also know is that behavioural phenotypes can vary across different groups. So this means that the factors that contribute to behaviours and the pathways and causes might be different in one syndrome group to another. So whilst we know that these behaviours and some of these characteristics are reported in SAPB2, when we started this research there was little information about the profile of behaviours and whether there are SAPB2 specific factors that might contribute or increase the likelihood of these behaviours occurring. And then this slide here is just to highlight my previous point about how behavioural phenotypes can differ across different syndrome groups. So for example, in the graph on the left, we can see that self-injury is more common, so high rates in Smith-Magenis syndrome compared to Angelman syndrome. But then we can see that aggression is more prevalent in Angelman and Smith-Magenis syndromes compared to other syndromes like Cornelia-de Lange syndrome. But the take-home message here is that across syndrome groups we can see differing profiles of behaviour. And so this is why it's really important that we take a syndrome-specific approach to our research, because each syndrome is individual. So this took us to our first study, where a questionnaire study was conducted within the Cerebral network to try and understand more about the profile of behaviours and the characteristics that might be associated with these behaviours in SAPE2. So this is currently the largest study of behaviour to ever be conducted in SAPE2, and the findings have been published in 2 different papers, both of which are open access for anyone who would like to take a look. But just for the purpose of today and in relation to behaviours that challenge, we can see that the findings showed that there were high rates in SAPE2, so high rates of self-injury and those behaviours directed towards objects of the environment, and then particularly high rates of those behaviours directed towards others, which were reported in just under 80% of individuals. And from this questionnaire data, we looked at differences in characteristics between individuals who did and did not show each form of behaviour. So we asked caregivers about a range of different characteristics and factors, such as health difficulties, autism characteristics, and behavioural characteristics, so things like impulsivity and overactivity. And what we found from this was that there are different characteristics associated with each form of behaviour. So, for example, high levels of anxiety and impulsivity in individuals who showed aggression compared to those who didn't. And when we took this a step further to look at characteristics that might statistically predict the presence or absence of each type of behaviour, the key characteristics were health difficulties and autism characteristics, so socio-communicative difficulties for self-injury, increased levels of impulsivity and compulsivity for behaviours directed towards others, and then compulsivity and being male for property destruction. And overall, these findings suggest that there might be some characteristics and their presence might increase the likelihood of these behaviours in an individual with SAPE2. But it's really important to note that just because a person shows some of these characteristics or difficulties, it doesn't mean that they will show behaviours that challenge. And there might be many other factors that influence whether these behaviours occur. So this brought us into our next study, where we conducted interviews with parents and caregivers to gain a more in-depth understanding of behaviours and the context of when they're occurring. So the aim here was to understand factors that might be causing and maintaining these behaviours in SAPE2. And whilst we asked about a range of the different behaviours, so self-injury, destruction and aggression, our focus here was really on those aggressive behaviours, just because they were the ones where there were particularly high rates reported in our questionnaire study. So during the interviews, we asked caregivers about a range of different things, so examples of when behaviours occur, what the triggers are, background factors, and management strategies that caregivers tend to use. So first we looked at the types of aggression shown by individuals. So these are shown in the chart on the right, and on here we can see that the most frequently reported types of those behaviours directed towards others were pulling or grabbing, so things like hair pulling or grabbing clothing, hitting behaviours such as slapping or kicking, and then we've got less frequent behaviours were also reported. So just focusing on the frequency and duration of behaviour, behaviours were fairly frequent, so the majority of parents and caregivers reported that behaviours would occur at least once a day to at least once a week. And then in terms of the duration of behaviour, durations reported suggest that these behaviours can be quite intense or prolonged. And then when asked to describe typical examples of when behaviour occurs, caregivers described a range of different triggers. So, for example, things like behaviours to request or access objects, a drive for social interaction, sensory inputs in the environment, and things not being in a certain place or position. So there's quite a lot of different triggers reported on this slide, but just for brevity, I'm going to focus on some of the ones that were most frequently reported by caregivers. So the most frequent one was non-preferred tasks or activities. So this included things like tasks that were too difficult or hard for the person, tasks that just weren't preferred or not a favourite activity to do. And this category also included things like when the person's given a choice that places a demand on them. So it's quite overwhelming being given different choices. Another frequently reported trigger was thwarted desires. So this included things like delays in access to tangibles, so the wait for dinner or the iPad, as well as things like being unable to go to a desired place or an activity they would like to continue ending. And these triggers were often mentioned in association with frustration and distress. And then one of the other frequently reported triggers were unexpected and unexplained changes. So these were associated with anxiety and distress as well, and also difficulties coping or responding to the uncertainty that was caused by the changes. So, for example, one caregiver has described that last-minute decisions or changes to plans, such as suddenly deciding to go for a walk, causes their child anxiety, and that's when the behaviours tend to occur. And then parents also describe background factors that might increase the likelihood of these behaviours occurring, or these background factors that might kind of make behaviours more severe when they do occur. And this included a range of different things, but first of all we had internal factors such as difficulties communicating wants or needs, or the reduced ability of others to understand the person's forms of communication. We also had things like pain or physical discomfort, hunger and poor sleep. So as an example, when talking to one caregiver, they described their child can be more agitated and susceptible to these behaviours towards others when they're unwell or in pain. And then external factors were also described, and these included things like overstimulation, so things like crowded, busy, noisy places, or extreme cold or heat, and situational specificity. So this was where caregivers were reporting that behaviour tended to occur with particular people or in particular settings. So for example, in this quote, we've got one caregiver describing how behaviour would typically occur at home rather than at school. And as with triggers for behaviour, caregivers described a range of different strategies to manage behaviours. So again, there's quite a lot on this slide, so I won't go into too much detail because Jane will be covering strategies to support and manage behaviours in the second half of this presentation. But just as an overview, caregivers reported preventative strategies, which were to reduce the likelihood of behaviours occurring. Active strategies, which were typically in response to behaviours that had started to occur, and then broad background strategies, which were usually used to try and alleviate behaviours that challenge or reduce the likelihood of them occurring in the long term. And then in addition to this, caregivers also described self-led strategies by the person with SAPBT. So we had self-soothing behaviours such as accessing a soothing object or toy, as well as the person withdrawing themselves from the situation. And these self-led strategies were reported in a small number of individuals. So overall, out of every caregiver that took part, it was about 20% of individuals who were reported to show these self-led strategies. But then just focusing on these caregiver-led strategies, the most frequent preventative strategy was explaining changes or situations. So this strategy was often described to support the person's understanding of changes or situations, reduce uncertainty and reduce the unexpectedness of those changes. And then frequent active strategies were giving the person space. So this was often used to avoid further escalation or alleviate behaviour, but it often did not immediately stop behaviours. And then another active strategy that was commonly reported was diverting or distracting the person. So this was to also prevent the behaviour from escalating. And then in terms of background strategies, frequent background strategies included monitoring background factors, so things like sleep, hunger, medication, as well as a focus on developing the person's skills. So a variety of skills were mentioned, but just to pull a couple of out, we had things like developing self-regulation skills and developing the person's communication skills. And what was really nice to see was that some of these strategies are ones that are evidence-based and are recommended. So just going back to the aims of our interview study, the findings are helping us to improve our understanding of how these behaviours towards others might develop or occur over time in SATB2. And combining our interview findings from our questionnaire findings, where we looked at characteristics associated with each form of behaviour, there were several factors that were indicated to be important for understanding what might lead to behaviour in SATB2. And just to pull out a couple of these things, we had anxiety and difficulties with uncertainty, as well as executive functions. So these executive functions are a set of brain-based cognitive processes that are involved in regulating thoughts, behaviours and emotions. And these processes have been linked to behaviours that challenge in previous research and other genetic syndromes. So our questionnaire study though showed that increased levels of impulsivity were associated with these behaviours towards others in SATB2. And in the wider literature, impulsivity has been associated with behaviours of challenge, and it is an indicator of reduced inhibition. So this executive function which reduces the ability to put the brakes on behaviour. And we've also seen that reduced cognitive flexibility has also been linked to difficulties with responding to changes in plans and routines, and that these are things that might trigger behaviours. So to examine these in SATB2, we looked at their executive functions and their relation to behaviour, as well as looking at responses to uncertainty and anxiety. So our assessment study was conducted remotely, and we had help from some parents and caregivers who completed some questionnaires and did a really brilliant job of administering a set of play-based tasks for us with their child or person they care for. And just in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on some of the key findings from these assessments. So one of the things we did was to compare executive functioning in SATB2 to that in typically developing children and autistic individuals. And this was to help build a picture of what the executive functioning skills look like in SATB2. So first looking at our questionnaire data, the comparisons indicated that individuals with SATB2 do experience difficulties with executive functions. So across executive functions, difficulties were greater in SATB2 compared to typically developing children who were aged 2 to 5 years. And these difficulties in SATB2 were similar to those experienced by autistic individuals, where we know that executive functioning difficulties are common. And we also found similar findings in our play-based executive functioning tasks. So performance was similar in SATB2 to autistic children for inhibition, so the ability to put the brakes on behaviour or withhold responses, as well as working memory. So this is the ability to process information and keep it in mind. But what we did see was that individuals with SATB2 found our cognitive flexibility tasks a bit more difficult compared to autistic children. So these were tasks where there was a need for them to switch the focus of attention and follow different rules. And what this suggests is that cognitive flexibility might be a particular area of difficulty for some individuals with SATB2. So we took this a step further and we looked at whether executive function difficulties are associated with behaviours that challenge, so whether they play a role in these behaviours. And we found that executive functions difficulties were all associated with more frequent and severe behaviours. And what we also found was that there was statistically significant association between these behaviours and levels of anxiety, difficulties coping or responding to uncertainty or changes, as well as increased repetitive behaviours. So, for example, an increased preference for routine or sameness. So these findings from our standardised assessments really indicate that executive functions are important for understanding why these behaviours might be occurring in some individuals with SATB2. And together they fit with what caregivers were telling us in the interviews and the questionnaire study. So this is really reassuring and has really helped to build up a picture of behaviours to inform these SATB2 specific models. So just going back to the research process, we have really started to build our understanding of behaviours and started to build models of why they might be occurring. So this just takes us now to the next part of this presentation where Dr. Jane Waite will be talking a little bit more detail about the practical strategies that might be useful for managing or supporting behaviour in SATB2.
Hi, thanks Lauren for that really comprehensive overview of your PhD. I'm now going to focus on strategies around 4 of the core trigger areas that Lauren identified as important to look at further. So unexpected changes, non-preferred activities and tasks, social interaction, and thwarted desire. So let's first look at unexpected changes. So when behaviour occurs in related to an unexpected change, one of the things that can be very helpful and that has been shown to be useful in other rare genetic syndromes is providing a cue of some sort that change is about to occur. Now, this will only be helpful in situations where you know as a parent or carer that there is a change and you're going to have to announce that change to the person that you support or care for. But in those situations, this can be a really helpful strategy. So you might have a card of some sort that you always show about 30 seconds before there is going to be a change. Over time, what happens is that if this card is reliably shown in most circumstances where these changes are about to occur, the person will learn that this card is a predictable indicator of change. So essentially what this means is that the person finds that change suddenly becomes a bit more predictable through the use of the card. Now, this would need to be repeated multiple times to become embedded and to be learned. This is not going to work overnight for sure, but it's something that if this is used reliably and regularly, can be helpful at making those changes a little bit more manageable. One of the things that's also related to unexpected changes is often intolerance of uncertainty. So people really struggle and get anxious around uncertainty in the world. And often parents in these situations will use strategies such as keeping things very consistent, very predictable, using things such as visual timetables, for example. And this can be really useful for reducing anxiety. But we also know that this is a bit of a double-edged sword as an approach. So when people are anxious, they want to avoid the thing that's making them anxious. And in this case, it's uncertainty. And we know that avoidance of the thing that makes us anxious can actually worsen anxiety over time. So this can make people a little bit more resistant to change as time goes on if you're using very structured schedules, for example. So what we would suggest is something called flexible scheduling, whereby you might make things predictable, but where possible, try to schedule in a change that the person can manage, or an activity, a question mark activity, where there's this predictable uncertainty on the horizon. And when this question mark activity occurs, the person is, whatever that activity is going to be enjoyable, it's going to be really rewarding, but essentially it allows that person to gradually learn that uncertainty is not necessarily something to be feared, and it can be managed effectively. Another tip for managing emotional responses to unexpected changes is to help those in the wider support system around the person with SAPB2 associated syndrome to learn about why emotional outbursts can occur, that there might be differences in brain-based processes, that and the executive functions, as Lauren has spoken about, might be compromised in people with SAPB2 associated syndrome somewhat. That wider understanding can often mean that the support networks are more appropriately ready to respond to those outbursts, are less likely to see the person as being stubborn or being difficult in some way, much more likely to be supportive, to give them the space and time they need to process their emotions. There is a lot of helpful strategies in these two guides that I would refer you to, and they are if you go onto the charity Cerebra's website, or you simply just type in Cerebra Emotional Outburst Guide for Parents or Cerebra Anxiety Guide for Parents, these guides are evidence-based, and they are full of tips around managing unexpected changes, managing anxiety in the context of intolerance of uncertainty, and they can be really helpful to share more broadly with educators and wider family members who are supporting you and your child. Now I want to talk about non-preferred activities and tasks. So what we know from years of behavioural research is that when children respond with behaviours that challenge in the face of non-preferred activities or tasks, there is a danger that those behaviours can be learned over time. So to give you an example, the challenging behaviour occurs in response to a non-preferred activity or a task. That leads to a whole host of emotions in parents and caregivers: concern, frustration, anxiety, confusion, distress, which then leads to parents or caregivers taking action. They want to do anything in that moment, as any parent would, to make that behaviour stop. So they offer a range of different responses, and eventually one of those responses will mean that the task that the person was doing, or the non-preferred activity, is stopped. This can be quite rewarding in that when the task stops, the person learns that the next time they have that desire for a task to stop, they know that challenger behaviour is an effective way of communicating that they want the task to stop. Now, this is not to say that people are doing this with intent, that they're planning this through and thinking, oh, if I do A, it will lead to B. That's not the case at all. It's just the fact that behaviours can be paired with consequences in time and gradually shaped so that they're more likely to occur when that person has a desire for a certain need to be met. Because of that, it's really important that if behaviours are occurring to escape from a non-preferred activity or task, that we think very carefully about how we respond in that situation. Now, if you suspect that's the case for your child, it's really important to request a clinical psychology or assessment, or an assessment from a behavioural specialist to confirm that, and then to work with that behavioural specialist on a number of different strategies. But essentially, the key components to responding to this type of behaviour are firstly to try not to remove the task when the behaviour occurs. If you must stop the task, come back to the task for a brief time and then stop the task when there's been no behaviour. So essentially what you want to do is break that link between the behaviour and the removal of the task that might have developed. You want to then break the task into a series of smaller tasks and give big rewards for the completion of tries. So try and work out how far it is possible, or how long it is possible for that child to engage with that task before they need a break. Then give them a break, praise them for the time they spent on it, and then gradually build up over time to them spending longer and longer on that specific task. It's really important to teach a way for a person to be able to request a break from a task that isn't a form of behaviour that challenges. So having a Makaton sign for stop, a Makaton sign for break, being able to use a pet card to request something to stop, or press a button on an iPad to request a break. If they do this, it's also really important that that's rewarded and responded to immediately, so the person is given what they want in that moment when they're learning to use this communicative behaviour. So the behaviour needs to be more effective than the behaviour that challenges. But what can happen then is the person's asking for things to stop continuously, which might not always be practical or feasible. So it is then possible then to gradually start to build in a little bit of a delay where you might stop, but after 10 seconds, and then build that up to 20 seconds, 30 seconds. So you're gradually getting the person to persist a little bit longer with the task and to work on that task as they're kind of building their resilience and their skill set in that moment. But it's really important to make sure everyone is doing the same thing when they're working together on this. So everyone supporting your child is following these same steps. So similarly, to how removal of a task can inadvertently, accidentally reward a behaviour, so can giving social interaction or giving access to a preferred object. So this happens that challenging behaviour occurs, it leads to concern, frustration, anxiety, confusion, distress for the parent, they take action, they engage. And this time they might offer a reward where they add something after the behaviour, so they give that iPad or they give that social interaction. And again, this can sometimes teach the individual inadvertently that actually next time they have that need to be met, if they engage in that behaviour, that might happen. And so the cycle continues. So there are certain tips, again, working with a clinical psychologist or a behavioural specialist. It's really important, if you suspect that the behaviour is maintained by social interaction, to make sure that if you must respond to behaviours that challenge, you do so in a way that is as non-rewarding as possible. So keep a really cool, neutral facial expression, very little speech, no eye contact, no fun. Okay, you want to be almost robotic in that situation where you might need to move over to keep your child safe or move them away from a sibling, but you want to keep it as basically, you want to be really boring. You want to then teach a communicative behaviour that can be used as an alternative to challenging behaviour to request social interaction. So again, Makaton PEX card or a button on an iPad. Make sure everyone responds to that and gives loads of social interaction if it's used, so it's much more effective than behaviour that challenges. So you're tipping the scale in the likelihood someone's going to use that more functional communication rather than a behaviour that challenges to have that need met. Make sure that at times when challenging behaviour isn't occurring, there's loads of opportunities for social interaction as well, and gradually increase the person's independence. So if they have more control over the environment, they're able to do more things independently, and schools are really good at encouraging independence and helping parents work towards that. And I'm sure many of you are doing these things already. But as that independence increases, the person's reliance on you for social interaction may reduce a little bit, which again reduces the opportunity for these behaviours to be inadvertently reinforced accidentally. Okay, now I just want to talk about thwarted desire. So these are emotional outbursts that occur in response to being told no or being blocked from doing something that a person wants to do. Now, in SAPI2 associated syndromes, Lauren's work suggests that there is potentially a difficulty with being able to put the brakes on those emotions, those overwhelming emotions, and this is a difficulty down regulating emotions in these situations. And so when people have emotional outbursts, it's often at the point when that happens very difficult to get those emotional outbursts under control. Often people might need some space and time to let off steam. But there are lots of proactive strategies that you could be working on in the background around times when outbursts aren't occurring. So for children with intellectual disability generally and rare genetic syndromes, often they may not pick up the emotional regulation strategies that parents use, that siblings use on a day-to-day basis in quite the same way. We need to explicitly teach strategies to help children calm, to relax, and to bring them back into a state where they are in much more control of their emotions. The way we do this is to practice strategies at points when children are calm, so when they're not experiencing emotional dysregulation, and to role play what you might do, or just to prompt if your child can't role play due to their degree of disability. It might simply be to prompt. It might be to prompt doing a big deep breath and then letting that breath out slowly. It might be prompting them to chew on a sensory toy, to squeeze something really hard and then shake out their muscles, to do star jumps, or if they have fewer support needs, to use videos like the box breathing videos on YouTube that encourage children to breathe very slowly and regulate their breathing very well. These strategies, when taught in calm situations and practiced regularly, are then much more likely to be successful when there might be early warning signs that children are becoming dysregulated. But they are strategies that need to be practiced over time. Again, they're a bit of a slow burn strategy, but really worth embedding into your daily routine. As are games that help to use executive functions, so teach children to stop and to go. So whether these are games where you dance about and then the music stops and you freeze, sort of typical childhood games that we might play with children, what we don't realize what we're doing during these games are actually training their executive functions, their ability to put the brakes on behavior. For children that might have difficulties in this area, playing these types of games regularly, games where you might do the actions that one teddy says, but not the actions that another teddy says, and interact in that way to kind of get children to have to stop their actions in certain situations. These are just really good games, again, to help build up that resilience. And there are versions of these games that you can play with older people as well around stopping and going. So they're definitely worth thinking about. Finally, I just want to talk about two more things. One is managing background factors. So very quickly, I'll talk about this. So Lauren alluded to the fact that there are a whole range of things that can be going on in the background that can increase the likelihood of behaviours being shown on a specific day. So such as being in pain, or maybe sensory overload if your child has sensory sensitivities. We know that pain is much more common in children with intellectual disability and rare genetic syndromes. Physical health conditions like ear infections, reflux, dental problems are more common in this population. So I would encourage you to take a look at the pain and sensory processing guides that we've produced that walk you through all of the things to be aware of about the best way to assess pain, the best way to capture that your child might be in pain, to share with a paediatrician in a way that's likely to get you an intervention or some support. And similarly with sensory processing, there are lots of hints and tips about how to manage the environment around the child to reduce the impact of sensory processing difficulties and differences on a day-to-day basis. Lastly, I want to now just summarise by bringing this together to mention the Be Well checklist. The Be Well checklist is a checklist that is again available via Cerebra. And the checklist helps summarise the most important things to look out for that might be contributing to behaviours that challenge. Now, in this very brief presentation, I can only touch on a few different strategies, but this guide is really comprehensive. It's comprehensive of thinking about all the things that need to be assessed, and then it also is comprehensive to signposting you to other resources that provide you with strategies. It helps you keep a record of behaviour and monitor that over time so you know whether the strategies are working. It guides conversations between yourself, educators and health professionals, and it generally just helps to streamline support and reduce distress levels over time. So I'd encourage people to download this. It's based on 250 published research articles, is strongly evidence-based, and will be very helpful for any families that are experiencing behaviours that challenge. So I am just going to say that essentially thank you to everybody who's taken part in the research. I would like to thank the broader research team as well. So this research wouldn't have been possible without a wide range of different people who've contributed to it over the last 4 years, and we're very grateful to those individuals. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today about our research.
All right. What an amazing presentation. So while they bring our speakers in virtually to join us, I want to go ahead and see if there's any Q&As for, oh, we've got them right there. All right, great. So does anybody have any questions? We've got them live joining us from the United Kingdom. Oh, Jenna.
Hey, what's up, Lauren? We actually did your study with Kennedy. Me and Jessica did it. So anybody in this room, definitely take part in it because it was really cool. They send you a box of toys to do with your kid, and you have the cameras set up around you, and they take all the data, and it helps everybody. So, hey.
Thank you. Anybody else? There's got to be some question about behavior. Here we go.
Is it possible to do the assessment with adults who wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to use the toys? Would there be other ways of doing that?
Lauren, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, there's certainly lots of different assessments that we could potentially use. We tried to select toys that or games that would be appropriate for a wide variety of ages. So we had people from 4 to 40 years who took part in our tasks that we did as part of the study. But certainly for individuals who are a bit more able, there will be other tasks that we could potentially conduct in future studies. I think you want to add anything to that, Jane?
No, just to say, I don't know if we mentioned, but the data collection for the current study has finished. So unfortunately, we won't be seeing any more families for this current study, but we are continuing the research in the future. And Lauren is moving on to her postdoctoral research position where she's going to be looking at sleep. So a real focus on an area that we haven't looked at in much detail yet, but we feel is really important for the next stages of her work. So if there are families that are interested in participating in research, we always try to make it as accessible to as many families as possible, and the research will be continuing with a slightly different focus, but kind of answering similar questions, building on the work that has already been conducted. There is a question on the chat as well, I think, just the one that I can see. I don't know if there's any more in the room.
We have one more right here. Well, we'll get to the chat in just a second.
Hi, we have a question in regards to the aggressive behavior only happens towards the parents, even though the child experiences anxiety and frustration in other settings, the behavior is never seen towards anybody else. Would you have any thoughts on that?
Lauren, do you want to, I'm just thinking about your interview study potentially there, and there's some really nice data there of families showing that sort of pattern that Lauren has some thoughts about. So don't want to jump in too soon. I'll just hand over to Lauren to answer that.
Yeah, absolutely. It was something that came up quite a lot in the interviews that I conducted with parents and caregivers. So a lot of parents talking about this situational kind of specificity of behaviours might only happen with them or certain family members, or it might only happen in certain situations at home. And we weren't really able to like disentangle whether it was something specific for why that was, but some of the ideas that we had were that it might be kind of the perceived familiarity of the situation or the people that the person was with, or maybe the perceived safety.
Yeah, we do tend to see sometimes this kind of pattern, particularly well, in other groups where we see quite a lot of autism characteristics, we might see people being able to push down or inhibit their emotions throughout the day, particularly if they're in a school setting, and then coming home and there's something very familiar, very safe about a home environment, and just can't hold on to it any longer, and then it just completely overspills at that point. And that's what Lauren was hypothesizing about, the sort of safety of that environment, the familiarity of that environment, because suddenly it's okay to let out those experiences and emotions that have been pent up during the day. And so that's one potential reason. Another reason sometimes we see differences might be because the response to the behavior is different across different settings. So if we take a very classic behavioral perspective, and sometimes we're looking at, what's the consequence following on from the behavior. And I presented some of those diagrams looking at sometimes behavior can be followed by social interaction. Sometimes it can be followed by, the delivery of a specific thing that somebody really wants. And that can vary. So sometimes you might find that in one setting, those consequences aren't in operation in the same way they are in another setting. So they get paired with one setting, this behavior happens in one setting, this leads to this consequence. But I think for a lot of I think it feels quite qualitatively different. So for a lot of Lauren's interviews, it felt much more like that pent-up release of emotion rather than the necessary, there being a specific consequence in a specific situation. But it does depend, you need a full behavioural assessment to be absolutely confident, but there's some of the things that, we would be looking out for.
Great, thank you. We've got a couple in the chat, so I'm going to ask those. So are they looking at the impact of medication on this population?
Yeah, so we had a few families report medications that they were using within the studies that we were conducting, but it wasn't something that we specifically asked about to be able to really capture whether that was a factor that might influence whether behaviours are occurring across the group. So it wasn't really something that we were able to do properly with the data that we had.
We have a lot of variation in medication and a lot of kind of so small quantities of people on specific in specific medications. We'd probably need much larger samples to be able to really plot the impact of medication. And also it's quite complex because you can be on medications for epilepsy or medications for anxiety that might impact behavior, and then medications for behavior that might impact other aspects of that person's behavioural presentation. So we have collected the information so we can report it alongside our research findings. But as Lauren said, it's not a primary aim at the moment. Although it is very important, and I think particularly probably in the context of the United States as well. That I don't know the difference in sort of prescribing cultures, but potentially there may be more need to look at that overseas potentially than in the UK, where medications are being withdrawn a great deal for challenging behaviour. That might also be the case in the United States, but I'm just not sure of the different policy contexts across those different countries.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one last question. So chat says, based on the comparative study between typically developing SAS and ASD, am I correct in understanding that SAS children fare worse in terms of executive functioning skills?
Yeah, so when we looked at the data compared to typically developing children, so this was data that's kind of available for the measure that we were using, and it's available for typically developing children who are aged between 2 and I think it was 5 years. So compared to those children, executive function was poorer in SATB2. And then when we looked at differences to autistic children, we kind of matched the participants. So someone with SATB2 who was aged 4 years and had a developmental age of 3 years might have been matched to someone who's autistic with the same sort of chronological age or developmental age. So we tried to kind of really account for that. And what we found there was that there were kind of similarities in executive function kind of levels between SATB2 and autism. But what we also saw was that, so these comparisons were at group level. So as a group level, executive function skills were kind of reduced in SATB2, but there were also differences. So some children or adults would have better executive functioning skills than others. So it was quite variable as well.
All right, thank you guys, Lauren and Shelley, for joining us for the United Kingdom and for doing all this work for us for so many years. They've been a great partner for all of our communities. I know we weren't able to get to every question in the chat, so we are recording, logging those questions, so we'll make sure that we get those back out and we will follow up. We're going to take a quick break, about 5 minutes, and then we'll start back here for our last session. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.